Well, hey, all you wiretappers out there, it's good to be back here in the studio of Gangland Wire. First of all, I want to introduce you to my friend and fellow mob historian, Frank Hayde. As you can see right there, I know many of you, and because I've seen you on Facebook talking about the Mafia and the Machine. Well, this is the dude that wrote the Mafia and the Machine, the first definitive history of the mob in Kansas City. So, and my friend Bill Owsley wrote another one called Open City, but this was the first one. And Frank, I know he was working on it at the time, and all of a sudden the both of them came out at about the same time, if I remember right. And, Frank helped me out with an interview. If you guys who have seen my ballot theft, burglary, murder, and cover up about the theft of the 1946 election, which a lot of you haven't. If you want to see it, you got to go to my website, and I can rent you a link for $1.99. But Frank helped me out with that, and he is an expert on the mob in Kansas City. The whole overview. Me, I mainly know about the skim days and the days when I was a copper, but I don't know that old history like Frank does. And today we're going to talk about the joining of the Irish political machine and the Italian mafia, and a man named Charlie Bonaggio that came out of it. Frank, welcome. I really appreciate you being here.
Gary, thank you for having me. It's great to be on your show.
So we've talked many times and emailed and that kind of thing, different things. And first time we've really had a show like this together. So this will be fun. Now, before we really get started, guys, Frank, tell them a little bit about the new book, which is really exciting because this is something I lived and was around during the time when this subject was hot. So tell them a little bit about your new book.
So I do have a new book coming out that is, in a way, a sequel to The Mafia and the Machine in the sense that it covers the KC underworld in the 1990s. So, all the other treatments of the KC mob basically end in the 80s with the skim and the big takedown and straw man. So this story kind of pushes the timeline forward into the 1990s. The book is going to be called Mafia Dreams. The subtitle is, what is my subtitle? My subtitle is a true crime saga of young men at the end of an era in Kansas City. So it's about some young guys who were trying to break into the life in the 1990s. You could maybe say that they were the last generation. These guys are my age now. They're in their early 50s now. Back then, they were in their mid 20s. And probably the last generation of young men really trying to break into the mafia life. And it's a fascinating story that centers around one particular case involving an FBI-involved shooting at a reverse drug sting. But it offers a window into the KC underworld of the 1990s. And Gary, I want to give credit where credit's due. You helped me a lot with this book. You introduced me to a couple of very interesting people who I was able to interview for the book, who knew some of the major players of it, knew some of the people and events that were going on that I'm covering in this book. So thank you for your help. I think it's going to be really enjoyable, and I hope that all you fellow wiretappers out there will have a chance to read it and enjoy it.
Yeah, I want you to get it too, guys. We'll talk more about it. We'll do a whole show on it whenever it comes out.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you a little bit I know about it. There's a whole big investigation over and around this incident that Frank's talking about, and we called it the Young Italians. They had a group of young guys, most of whom were Italian, most of whom, a couple of them were like relatives of the old school mob guys. And of course, back in the day, the old school guys, they earned their bones, shall we say, with Prohibition. Well, we've got the modern day Prohibition. We've got drugs. We've got cocaine. And that's where the money is. And that's where that show goes or that story goes. And I've got a U.S. attorney out here that handled prosecution on one of those guys on a separate drug case. I'm going to get Chuck on here to tell that story about the time we do Frank's story about the situation he's talking about, which is, it was really dramatic. I mean, I'm just going to leave it at that, guys. It was really a dramatic situation that played out on every TV screen in Kansas City before the first week or two was up after FBI shooting. So it was quite a story.
You're right. It was very dramatic at the time, made a big local splash, and then was quickly forgotten about.
Exactly.
So I'm hoping that this is a very deep dive investigative story, and it takes us pretty deep into the backstory. And I think a lot of Kansas Cityans are going to be sort of shocked. Kind of one of those eye-popping books.
I got a feeling it is. Anyhow, so today we're going to talk about Charlie Banaggio, which was a fascinating, interesting guy. This was a mob guy. I found some old newspaper articles, Frank, and I know you've probably seen them, where the newspaper, the Kansas City Star, is talking about Charlie Banaggio casually strolling in and out of the governor's office, the governor of the state. That's how far the mob got in with state level politics at the time. So let's go back a little bit about where did Charlie Banaggio come from? He came from the North End, I got to assume, and came up through the normal way. What do you remember about his early days?
Yeah, well, I was actually born in Texas, and he seems to have some connection to Denver also, because I know he spent some time when he was a young man in Denver, but he did grow up in the North End. And I believe he was godson to James Balistreri, or maybe it was Joe DiGiovanni. I can't remember, but he was a godson to one of the big, Mustache Pete dons in KC. And after Lazia died, when Lazia died, Charlie Banaggio was one of the pallbearers.
Mm-hmm. Now Johnny Lazia was he was really close to the Irish political boss named James Pendergast. Johnny Lazia was his man in the North End, which is Little Italy, and Lazia actually had a office on the 5th floor, maybe not the 5th, the 3rd floor police headquarters, right down from the chief of police at one time. So Banaggio learned at the feet of the best, who was a mob boss and a political boss at the same time. So
and that's kind of the most important takeaway about Banaggio is the fact that he was both, and in that sense he was unique. He truly was a mafia boss and a political boss at the same time. And yes, I'm glad you mentioned Johnny Lazia and Tom Pendergast, because that whole era, which is documented in my book, The Mafia and the Machine, really set the stage for Banaggio. Together, Lazia and Pendergast created this machine mob alliance, which became so powerful and which basically sewed the city up tight and made it the open city that Banaggio, in a way, inherited. But when he was a pallbearer at Johnny Lazia's funeral, that's sort of when people noticed, hey, this guy's an up-and-comer. This is someone, to keep your eye on, whether you were in the underworld or in law enforcement. Either way, seeing him as a pallbearer, was a heads up that this was a future player in the Kansas City family.
Did he ever hold political office at all?
He never did hold, just like Tom Pendergast, he never held political office, but he, for a time, the most influential, the most powerful Democrat in Jackson County. And Banaggio was actually known publicly as an influential Democrat. If his name appeared in the paper, whether it was local paper or New York Times or some other publication from some other city, he was usually referred to as a Kansas City Democrat, mm-hmm. or a powerful Democrat, an influential Democrat. That was his public persona, even though it was quite clear, especially at least in Kansas City and in Missouri, that he was more than just a Democrat. He was.
How do you think he walked that line?
It's fascinating. That's one of the things that fascinates me so much about Charlie Banaggio, how he could do both at the same time. That was something that happened in Kansas City. I've always said that the Kansas City family was typical in the sense that, all the characteristics that we associate with the American mafia, we see in Kansas City. But one thing that I think sets the Kansas City family apart was it was so closely aligned with politics to a degree that other families were not. Even Chicago, I don't think was quite as tightly weaved like a basket almost, with OC and politics, as it was in Kansas City for a couple of decades. And the Kansas City family seems to have had this unique arrangement where the old guys, the real serious mafiosi, the mustache peaks, guys like the DiGiovanni brothers and James Balistreri, James Filardo, the DeLuca brothers. These guys were behind the scenes, quiet, secretive, shadowy, speaking with broken English. But they understood that political power was essential to a strong and flourishing crime family. And so they put these guys out front, guys like Johnny Lazio, and then later Charlie Carollo to a point, and then Charlie Banaggio. And the old mustache Pete's seemed to be pretty comfortable having these guys out front who were very public and who were known as big time Democrats. And so I think if Banaggio had been in any other crime family in the country, I don't know that he would have been able to become both a mob boss and a political boss at the same time. But in Kansas City, the conditions were such that was kind of the way it worked.
It was okay for him to have his name in the paper once in a while, and it was okay for him to know policemen and judges and be friends with them and drink with them and go to functions with them and that kind of thing. Whereas the old school mob guys, they wouldn't even talk to anybody outside of their little closed circle. And now this guy's, he's like out there. Now, what were some of the things he would do, this was gambling times, Prohibition's over. So the mob goes into gambling. They have a wire service, get horse racing results here in Kansas City, and a lot of betting action on horse races back then. And of course, local games and off the books casinos. And Nick Savella, our guy that became our modern boss, he had a little casino like thing almost down on Baltimore. And so that's where their money was coming from. And so what did Banaggio do in that realm?
Yeah, he was definitely deeply involved in gambling. There was a lot of drug dealing going on at that time within the family. Major heroin trafficking happening nationally, and Kansas City was kind of at the center of that. And that was during the Banaggio reign. I don't think that Charlie himself was involved directly in the drug rings, but he held a position of power while all that was happening. And then you mentioned the race wire, Gary, and that was, I think, the big one for Banaggio, because he really helped grow that race wire and expand the reach of the race wire and make it more profitable. And he did that working in concert with Chicago. And Chicago, I think, really appreciated that. I mean, Banaggio was able to use his political contacts, in fact, to get an injunction against shutting down the race wire. Mm-hmm. So I think Chicago looked at this guy in Kansas City and said, "Hey, man, this guy, he's got political contacts. He knows how to make money. The race wire, when that thing was happening and there was a lot of conflict between a couple of competing services, there was some violence in some other cities. And in Kansas City, it was just smooth as can be. And Banaggio really, as far as Chicago was concerned, deserved a lot of credit for that. So here you have Charlie Banaggio in the mid-40s, who's kind of emerged out front as the face of the Kansas City mob and a powerful Democrat. And he's also expanding the rackets, not just for the KC family, but for the national syndicate also. So his star at this time is just really on the rise, both locally and nationally.
Yeah, I think I kind of remember now, especially by the war, they had Pendergast. The politics in Kansas City in 1939, there was a new broom sweeps clean, and they swept out a lot of the Pendergast people, but they didn't sweep out the mob guys. They didn't sweep out the first ward down there in the north end, and they also reached out into the second ward and still held a big chunk of the vote. So even though you've got these squeaky clean politicians that were sweeping out some bad guys, they had such a hold on those 2 or 3 wards down there that you couldn't really ignore them, and there weren't any cases that were made on them. Made one case on Pendergast, put him in jail, but Binaggio, they didn't make any cases on him for whatever reason, and so they had to deal with him, and that's when I think that's when he thought he almost, his reach ended up exceeding his grasp nationally, but that's when I think he really, came into his own, was during the war after Pendergast was gone.
Right, that's a real good point, because I think Binaggio really represented a comeback for the mafia and the machine, because in 1939 you had the takedown of Tom Pendergast, and Charlie Corolla went down with him. Charlie ended up in Alcatraz. Pendergast ended up in Leavenworth, and the reformers came in. And I think there were some people around who thought, oh, well, that's the end of that, But it was not at all. The mafia was too entrenched. And they cleverly also, you're right, they maintained their grip on those river wards in the city, but they also pushed out into the county, really, at this time in the 40s. And they said, well, okay, we're under scrutiny in Kansas City, but Jackson County is a different story. Let's get out into the unincorporated areas on the fringes of the city. We'll set up operations there. And that's what they did, and it worked. And, it still wasn't like it was in the 30s. Mm-hmm. But that was part of what the old guys, I think, charged Binaggio with. They said, we want you to make it the way it used to be, back in the 30s, the good old days. So see what you can do. And I think that was his objective, was to bring gambling, especially, back to the level that it had been under Pendergast and Lazia. I think that's probably where we're going next with this, is what did he do and how did events transpire for him to achieve that comeback?
I know they had some carpet joints out, what we call a carpet joint. It was like a country club. They had one up in Platte County, Mirror Lake. They're all out in unincorporated areas. There was one in south, just outside the city limits in Kansas City South. And then on the eastern Jackson County, there was a lot of bars, and they had slot machines in those bars. So they were trying to open this back up. That was his whole thing, was to open it up.
Yeah, but Binaggio wanted to go one step further. I'm not sure if it was his vision or if it was the old guy's vision, and they're just kind of using him as the means to achieve it. But the idea was to make the entire state of Missouri a wide open state. Might seem like a pipe dream, the way things were in the 30s under Pendergast and Lazia, and the sheer amount of corruption, that was going on in Kansas City, Jackson County. Maybe it wasn't such a pipe dream after all. I think that the syndicate guys saw this as entirely realistic and entirely possible. If they could corrupt the right officials, they could swing the elections, they could control the politicians, and they could open up Kansas City, St. Louis, and all the other medium-sized towns in the state to police-protected vice, gambling. And that was Binaggio's big goal. It was very ambitious. He went a long way. He came very close to achieving it. Basically, what happened was, I guess it kind of started before that 1946 election. And I know, Gary, you did an entire film about the 46 election, and we can touch on that briefly here now.
Well, hey, guys, I recommend the amazing detective series written by my friend and fellow attorney, Dan Flanagan. Set in the 1980s, the Peter O'Keefe series follows the exploits of a troubled Vietnam vet turned private detective. Peter O'Keefe encounters corrupt businessmen, cocaine smugglers, outfit mobsters, tipsters, and hustlers. In the latest installment, On Lonesome Roads, the outfit forces O'Keefe to make a devil's bargain to safeguard his loved ones and uncover the truth behind attempts on his life. Check it out now. If you love thrilling mysteries, these are must-read books. I promise you, Dan gets it right. Read his books today.
I'd encourage everybody to see Gary's film, because the 1946 election alone, as its own issue, is just incredibly fascinating. Make a long story short, Binaggio nominated, or he got behind certain candidates that were in opposition to Jim Pendergast, Tom's nephew. Binaggio started presenting a challenge to the Pendergast machine, the establishment, the Democratic establishment. In this 46 election, Harry Truman, who was president by now, he's president of the United States. You've got a Jackson County guy in the White House. That bodes well for the Democrats in Missouri, which means that bodes well for the mob in Missouri. President Truman made it clear he wanted a new congressman. Binaggio got behind that movement to nominate a different congressman than the incumbent.
My dear Jim, I had hoped to see you Sunday afternoon or evening. A great many friends and acquaintances dropped in. I wanted to talk with you about Slaughter. He has become insufferable to the administration because of his actions as a member of the powerful Rules Committee of the House. He owes his position on that committee to me. The meanest partisan Republican has been no more anti-Truman than Slaughter. It seems that is what confronts me, much to my regret. Slaughter is obnoxious to me, and you must make your choice. Hope your family are well. Sincerely, Harry.
And he was able to do the same types of things that the guys did back in the 30s. Stuffed ballot boxes, ghost voters, intimidation at the polls, basically stole the election in the primary. This guy might have won anyway, but they weren't taking any chances. So they fell back on all their old tricks. The machine and the mafia, more or less stole that primary election. Authorities, law enforcement investigated, and they seized all the ballots, and they put them in a safe in the basement of the Jackson County Courthouse. That very same night, a crew of demolition guys goes in, blows the safe, steals all the ballots, all the evidence. All the indictments ended up being dismissed because there was no more evidence. It was this incredibly bold and brazen event that really brought a lot of scrutiny and a lot of attention to Jackson County. But in the eyes of the national syndicate, this was great stuff, right?
Yeah.
And they're looking at this Binaggio guy going, who is this guy in Kansas City? He first of all, he steals an election, and then he goes and steals the evidence. And this guy's, got balls, right?
And then they got a woman that's gonna rat him out on it, and they kill her. They murder her in broad daylight with a shotgun. It was an obvious mob hit. Mary Bonomo. It was just like crazy. She was her boyfriend was the nitro guy who blew the safe for them. They hired him to blow the safe, and then she knew about it, and she had something she wanted. She went to the U.S. attorney. She wanted to get her actually it was her husband. This was her son-in-law that did it. She wanted to get her husband out of the penitentiary, so she offered to give up these guys for that burglary of the ballots, and then the next day they blew her away. So that's how bold and how brazen they were, and got away with it. It just disappeared. Disappeared after this.
Yeah, and I think so. This illustrates again two sides of Binaggio's personality. He on one hand, he's a politician who's heavily involved in delivering an election for the president of the United States. On the other hand, he's part of this ruthless and vicious organization that murders women in broad daylight and steals evidence right out of a safe in the Jackson County Courthouse with the sheriff's office right upstairs. So I think if you're in the national syndicate, if you're in New York, Chicago, wherever, you're looking at this guy saying, wow, this guy's got political power and muscle. Yeah. And this is someone we need to be paying attention to. And then this is about the same time, that he's growing that race wire racket.
Yeah.
On mainly for Chicago's benefit. Again, he's like a superstar. He's like a mob superstar.
Now it kind of went to his head because he really took off then. He got into the whole statewide thing, as you mentioned before, wanting to open up the whole state. Well, to open up the whole state, you need the governor. You need somebody over the highway patrol. And the local sheriffs, they didn't have too much worry about, but you needed somebody in the governor's office or the governor. And that's when this was the beginning of his end. That's when his hubris rose, as they say. When hubris rises, nemesis always appears. Those are like Greek gods, and so his hubris was on the rise, and he was gonna open up the state.
Yeah, and that takes us to the next election. So we had the 46 election with the ballot theft, and then the 48 election. At this point, Benignazio has surpassed Jim Pendergast, and the mafia is no longer subservient to the Pendergasts politically. Charlie Benignazio is in charge of the mafia and the machine. First time in history that it's happened, maybe the only time, certainly the only time in Kansas City, and probably, I'm guessing, the only time nationally where one guy occupied that role, those dual roles. In the 48 election, this is when he's reaching out to the national syndicate. This is when he's saying, hey, guys, invest in me, invest in Kansas City, because we're going to make Missouri a wide open state. You guys can come in from New York, Chicago, other places, and run operations. They'll be protected. I'm going to grease the skids for you, and we're going to get the job done. So you had Frank Costello in New York investing money in Charlie Benignazio. You had the Fischetti brothers up in Chicago investing money into Charlie Benignazio. Benignazio is working closely with the LCN in St. Louis to make this happen. And money is just pouring into Benignazio's coffers. And he's using it like crazy in this 1948 election. Overwhelmed his opposition both in the primary and the general election. He gets his governor, like you were talking about, Gary.
Yeah.
And he's poised to make Missouri a wide open state. At this point, he's the most powerful Democrat in Jackson County. This is like you were saying, this is the time when he's dropping in to see the governor whenever he feels like it, basically. He is going into the state house during legislative sessions, even though, some of these sessions are typically closed to outsiders. If you're not an elected official, you got no business being in there. But there's Charlie Benignazio, and he's got control over, probably close to a dozen state representatives and almost as many state senators. He can swing elections. Democrats all over the state start calling him judge out of respect for his ability to be a mover and shaker within the party. He's appeared in Life magazine and Look magazine and other big publications as this prominent Democrat. And then they get into his underworld ties and that kind of thing too. This is the pinnacle for Charlie Benignazio. But unfortunately for him, it doesn't last.
Now, at this time, he's this front guy and everybody knows him, but he's got a partner, shall we say, a guy named Charlie Gargata. And Charlie Gargata is a real deal mobster, not a politician. Charlie Gargata went all the way back to got in a shootout with a local sheriff when he was in the middle of a mob hit of Anton Ferris, I think the guy's name was, a bar owner. The county sheriff drives up and they get in a shootout and the guy, here's what he got. The sheriff saw him kill this guy, right? And the sheriff and I think a deputy. And he saw him kill this guy and they got him, they caught him, and he had a gun that was stolen out of the armory over here in Kansas City, Kansas, a 45, one of those 1911 45 pistols. And you know what he got? He got his final conviction in Jackson County was for possession of a stolen pistol. And he did not very much time. They couldn't even convict him of that murder. That's how corrupt Jackson County was back in that time.
And I'll just add one small detail to that story, which is that Gargata unloaded that pistol at Sheriff.
At the sheriff. Yeah, that's right. I forgot.
And it was a clear-cut case of attempted murder against the county sheriff.
Yeah, I know.
And he got off scot-free because the KCPD fabricated evidence.
Yeah.
And
changed the gun, I think. I think they
changed the evidence tag on the gun. And there was a corrupt prosecutor at that time who kept giving continuance after continuance. It was probably one of the most, cases of, if you want to just look at a case study of urban corruption. You
That's
know,
it. Yeah.
with mafia involvement, the Charlie Gargata case is perfect for that. And it goes on and on. It gets really deep in the weeds and very fascinating case. But yeah, you're right. Gargata, that was back in the Lazia days, but now Gargata is Binaggio's right hand man, and that's an interesting relationship because Binaggio was not a heavy guy. He was not an intimidator. I mean,
Yeah.
he was a friendly neighbor. Nothing thuggish about the guy at all. I even wonder sometimes if he was even a made guy
Yeah.
because back then in KC you had to kill somebody to become a made guy. I'm not sure Binaggio was really that type of person. If he was not a made man, he was certainly an extremely powerful associate. But Gargata, like you said, Gary, he was the real deal in terms of a mafia killer. Um, and so, Charlie Binaggio, when he's walking around town, going from joint to joint, collecting envelopes, whatever, he's got Gargata right there by his side. And Binaggio can put forward that public friendly politician's face, but right next to
Right
him
there. Yeah.
is that menacing,
Yeah.
mafia stare of Charlie Gargata. So again, you got both, the mafia and the machine, just again hand in glove right there in the form of
What's kind of interesting
Charlies.
about that is in modern times, Pablo Escobar, they had a saying down there when they were dealing with politicians: lead or silver. Well, that's what we had with Gargata and Binaggio. We had lead or silver.
Interesting. Yeah, I
Binaggio
like
could
that.
reward you,
I
with a
like that.
job
Yeah.
or business or whatever, county contracts or
Yeah.
whatever, connect political connections, or you got lead.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. I like that. And that's very fitting for those two for sure. The two Charlies, they called them, and yeah, interesting relationship for sure.
But something happened, and I believe was that Governor of Smith, Harry Smith, was that his name?
Let's see. That governor, I think, was Forrest Smith.
Forrest Smith.
Yeah.
So what happened with Forrest Smith? When
Okay, so
he
yeah,
was supposed to appoint a real gambling friendly police board and gambling friendly people in the state patrol and in St. Louis, and
yeah, I think Governor Smith, like a typical politician, was playing both sides of the fence. I think he really did appreciate Binaggio. He was indebted to Binaggio. He understood that. I'm sure he had some respect for the Gargata side
yeah.
of the two Charlie mafia machine relationship, but he was able to kind of, he did do some favors for Binaggio. He made some appointments that were favorable to Binaggio. Like for example, he appointed two men to the Kansas City Police Board that were more or less open to working with Binaggio, but there was two holdovers from the previous administration. And he needed three out. Binaggio needed 3 out of the 4 votes, to really get anything, make some serious changes to the type of changes that would open up the city and the county to protect gambling. And he didn't quite have that. So Governor Smith was able to toss Binaggio a bone here and there without ever really opening things up to the degree that Charlie needed him to. And when I say needed, talking about at this point, Binaggio was under a tremendous amount of pressure from the old guys in KC and from the national syndicate. These guys had invested all this money with him. And so far, the state still hadn't opened up. Binaggio was starting to get very nervous. And he knew that he was in a position where if he didn't deliver on this, he was either going to have to pay back all that money or the lead, like you said, Gary, or the lead was coming. At this point in the story, I start to feel sorry for Binaggio. I can just kind of feel the downward spiral and the hopelessness that he's experiencing. He was so high up on top. He was just at the pinnacle of political power and syndicate power. And now all of a sudden he's in the hot seat and he's so close to making it happen, but he just can't cross the finish line. And so sure enough, we end up with one of the most sensational, I think, gangland killings in the history of the American Mafia.
Yeah, it was a pivotal moment nationwide, because really this event here stirred the not McClellan hearings, but the Kefauver hearings.
Yeah.
Kefauver came out of this particular murder of the two Charlies, the murder of the two Charlies. Plus, back in those days, guys, they would allow photographers access immediately, and newspaper reporters. Anybody had access to a crime scene. This was a hell of a crime scene. So tell us about that crime scene and what happened that night. It's a pretty good story.
I won't go into too much of the backstory about what Binaggio was doing in the days and hours leading up to the event, but the two Charlies, Binaggio and Gargata, were at the Democratic Club that Binaggio ran down on Truman Road. And this was the newly named Truman Road. Behind me, you can see a portrait of Harry Truman.
Oh, yeah.
So again, we've got Truman in the White House, and they've now named a prominent road in Kansas City after Harry Truman, and that is where Binaggio's Democratic Club is situated. Sometime in the evening hours, as Binaggio and Gargata sat there in the Democratic Club, which was closed, this was after hours now. It was no longer open to the public. So they were in there behind closed doors and with some other people. And who those other people were, we can speculate. I think Gary probably has some thoughts and opinions on that. But Binaggio and Gargata both ended up shot and killed. Binaggio got 4 bullets to the back of the head. He was slumped in his chair. Gargata, it appears, tried to exit, moving towards the front door, was shot, I think, also in the head. This picture, which is in my book, really did cause a sensation. I'll see if I can just kind of hold it up to the camera. It's pretty small here, but here's the picture too with right here with Charlie Gargata's corpse, blood oozing out of his head, and a giant portrait of Harry Truman looking down at the crime scene.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a Republican,
it's gold.
This is like a gift from the gods. I mean, here you've got a gangland, a sensational double murder. I call this the double murder at the Democratic Club.
Yeah.
I've also heard it referred to as the murder of the two Charlies, or the killing of the two Charlies. But the double murder at the Democratic Club, with Harry Truman looking down at the crime scene. And the implication was that Truman was closely connected to the Pendergast machine. That was no secret. And so, the Star was more or less, believe it or not, Republican at that time.
Yeah.
And they sold this picture, to every other newspaper in the country. And the implication was, hey, the political corruption and the mob connections in Kansas City go all the way up to the White House. And that was the implication. Now, personally, I don't believe that Harry Truman was mobbed up. I think he was an honest politician. And he never denied that he owed a lot to Tom Pendergast. Very, very little evidence, though, to suggest that he was in tight with the mob. However, this caused such a stir that it forced Truman to get behind this Kefauver investigation. He had opposed it up to that point because he knew it was going to make the Democrats look bad.
Yeah.
Because, there was so many connections between the Democrats and the mafia nationwide. But after this event, Truman could no longer oppose it. He said, yeah, we got to do this. Go ahead, Mr. Senator Kefauver, and do your investigation of organized crime and interstate commerce. So the double murder at the Democratic Club in Kansas City is what led to that pivotal event. And as many of you wiretappers know, that Kefauver hearings exposed the national mafia syndicate like it had never been exposed before. And that's when people really started to understand what this thing was and what was going on in the major cities in the country. And it was very shocking to most people who thought of crime as a local affair and never really thought that there was this sinister national syndicate working behind the scenes to swing elections and to corrupt labor unions and to make millions and millions of dollars through illegal gambling and prostitution and all the rackets. So that was the legacy of the double murder at the Democratic Club.
Yeah, and then another event that fired people up was, at the time, that's when TV first came in. And so I understand that these keep offer hearings, they were televised, a lot of them, and people were buying TVs just to see the keep offer hearings. And this became like on a national basis, every major city in the United States, people were looking at their local mobsters coming, and they were showing up, and they were being mobsters. They were refusing to answer questions, taking the Fifth Amendment. Nobody had ever seen that before. They just hear about this stuff. Well, I know, I bought something that fell off a truck. To them, it's kind of cute and fun. Or, they've got gambling over at that one place, and I went down there one time, that kind of thing. But now all of a sudden they see, as you say, these connections that these guys got, and the connections into the government, and then they see them face to face. They see what they look like. Say a guy like Joey Gallo with his sharkskin suit and white tie and sunglasses inside and that kind of thing. They see the face of the mob.
Well, yeah, or Frank Costello's hands, right? Because that was somehow Costello's lawyer got an injunction where the TV cameras couldn't film his client's face, and so they filmed his hands, and he's very expressive in that typically Italian way, where a lot of hand gestures when he talks, and so cameras focused on his hands, and that image was one of the most really lasting images in the history of television, as far as I'm concerned. Because like you said, it was at the very beginning when television was just catching on, and that unusual image of Frank Costello's voice accompanied by his hands really was fascinating to many people. And then, of course, unfortunately, the TV didn't get involved until after the KC hearing, because if they had,
I had not seen that. I wondered.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate, because we would have got some great footage of these KC gangsters, especially Fat Tony Gizzo, counting his money. At one point,
you got to tell folks that story. You got to describe that scene. Do you remember that scene? They asked him about how much money he had. And
it was they asked him about the mafia, and he kind of slipped up a little bit and sort of tacitly admitted to the existence of the mafia, and then he kind of tried to backpedal. And then one of the senators said, "Oh, I understand that you tend to carry a lot of cash around in your pocket." And he said, "You want to see it?" And he pulls out his roll of cash and just starts counting out $100 bill after $100 bill, right there in front of the cameras and the senators. And there's a good picture of that in my book too, which is that's the book cool. Right there. But
during the war, if you remember, Paul Ricca and Charlie Cherry Nose Joey, and little Louis Campagna, and several mob outfit bosses out of Chicago got caught up in extorting money from Hollywood producers and the unions out there. And it was a national thing. They all went to jail. Well, Harry Truman had his attorney general, Tom Clark, who he will later make a Supreme Court justice before he leaves office. Tom Clark is the U.S. attorney, and those guys all get out in about 3 years, and there's a lot of supposition. It was a big scandal at the time that Tom Clark is the one that gave the final approval to let those Chicago outfit guys out after about, I think, a little less than 3 years in the penitentiary on a 10-year bit. So, politics and the mob, they don't have that anymore. That's one reason they don't have any power. Back then, they had power because they had political connections. They could get out the vote. They could get you elected, as we found out in 46, or they could make sure you didn't get elected.
And I would argue that alliance between organized crime and politics reached its pinnacle in Kansas City in the late 1940s under the reign of Charlie Banaggio.
Yeah,
someone in New York or Chicago might want to argue with me, and I'd love to have that conversation. And I'm sure they would have a lot of good points.
Yeah.
But I do believe that was the case, and fascinating chapter of the overall Kansas City story. And I think that it represents not just the pinnacle of politics, but also the high watermark of the mob's influence in the United States, during about 1950 or so. So, and then from there, you get into a brief reign of Tony Gizzo as boss, and then into the Sevilla era, which is its a whole another world, a whole another era of intrigue and fascination.
That was the next generation, shall we say. It's a whole other story there. Nick Sevilla is a young guy at this time.
Right.
During the murder of the two Charlies. A lot of people ask me if, well, you think he was involved with it? And I talked to Bill Owsley, and he doesn't really think he was probably involved. He thinks it probably a guy named Black Louis Congolosi and who was all of a sudden I've lost the names. One of the other guys who was involved in the burglary of the Jackson County courthouse. Like that.
Thomas Simone, I think.
Thomas Simone, Highway Simone. And so people like that, because Kansas City, it was their job. It was their man. It was their job. That didn't come from outside. That was right. That was approved of by the National Crime Syndicate, of course, the commission. They approved of it, but then they come back to Kansas City and say, you got to take care of this. And, they had to kill.
Yeah. And there was at that time, the family probably had a dozen different guys that could have done that. They had so many heavy hitters at that time. I've heard speculate, those names that you brought up, Gary, but I've also heard, that Nick Sevilla probably did the deed. And that's how he really, made his bones and got on the fast track to leadership. That seems like a very plausible theory to me.
Yeah,
and I would not be at all surprised if Nick was in that room.
Somebody that they were comfortable with had to be in that room.
Yeah,
there was no signs of a struggle other than Gargata trying to run out the front door.
Last minute,
Bernagio was just sitting behind his desk, all relaxed. So they met somebody there that they were comfortable enough to be in that room with.
Tuffy DeLuna was 23 years old at the time. He was trying to make a name for himself. Yeah. I know that Jimmy Duarte was a suspect in that double murder. He was interviewed. He was taken into custody and interviewed over that. But they never did find out who did it. Their murder remains unsolved.
Well, in all fairness to those guys, we've never solved a mob murder in Kansas City. There's never been a mob murder that's been solved. Except one time some guy hired some other outsiders to do a murder, and they took down that one. I'm a mob associate with them, but the outsiders, they'll break every time.
So Gary, earlier, well, it's probably the topic for a whole nother podcast, but I was curious about the DeLuca brothers, and because they seemed to, they were players behind the scenes guys, Mustache Pete's more or less, who were probably, pulling strings behind the scenes during the Bernagio era, but I think they were still around at the time that you were investigating things, and I was just curious if you ever had any dealings with them.
No, I didn't, not at all. Nick Sevilla and Tuffy DeLuna and Cork Sevilla, they were front and center. They're the only people. They were the face of the mob to law enforcement by those years, by 1970s, late 60s, early 70s.
Interesting though, how even then, even in the 70s, some of these old guys were still around.
Yeah, Joe Filardo,
the DeLuca brothers, Filardo, and you figure, maybe they still had some influence, certainly.
Tano Lococo. Yeah, we used to see Joe Filardo and Tano Lococo, and the DeLuca brothers and Dia Giovanni, and they were like the old sugar house syndicate that cornered all the sugar in order to, the Prohibition. They were pretty young at the time. And those two, we used to see those two guys together. Filardo, who had a bakery, and Tano Lococo, used to see them together a lot. They would ride around together. So they were, everybody, the word was, they were like, if they needed some advice, you want some advice, about what was going on. I'll never forget, I followed them in. I just saw them go in an office building downtown. So I just parked and jumped out and went in behind them, got on the elevator with them. They were going up to a lawyer's office. There were these two little old, like 4'11", dried up, little sticks of men that were once these giant feared mafia guys, go figure. I mean, Florida was at Appalachian, for God's sakes, with Nick Savella. So, it was a surreal experience for me being on the elevator with those two old guys.
Well, and I just, if I could just, as we wrap things up here, I'll just mention that Panel Lococo, I believe he died at age 98.
Yeah.
In about 1993, 1994. Again, we get back to who's carrying the coffin, right?
Yeah.
So you were talking about the young Italians,
yeah.
and I know that some of those young Italians were carrying the coffin of Gaetano Lococo.
Yeah.
And some of those guys are the ones who appear in my next book, Mafia Dreams,
right.
which will be out. It'll be out in about 6 weeks, I think.
Okay, we'll get you.
And I'm really looking forward to coming back on your podcast because I definitely wanted to debut this book on Gangland Wire because you were so helpful with this book, Gary, introducing me to these people that I interviewed for the book, and you've been super supportive, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and folks, by the way, the last man standing out of those young Italians just got out of the penitentiary from this murder we talked about, of the FBI shooting. He just got out of the penitentiary. He's out here today working at a used car dealership. He'll be real interested in this. I don't know if you've talked to him since he got out, but he's
you're talking about Mike Albanese.
Yeah,
and he participated in my book. He was willing to be interviewed, and I really appreciate him for that. He was very candid, and I'm not saying that he admitted to very much,
no.
But he has his perspective, and he was more than willing to share it. Yeah, he did 25 and a half years in prison. He went in at the age of 25 and got out at the age of 50. And he really represents that group of young Italians who had their own mafia dreams back in the 1990s and got wrapped up in this fascinating case, which involved a murder and a drug sting and a lot of interesting legal implications. I was able to speak with the lead agent on the case too, Agent Ron Halter. He was also very gracious and willing to share his memories and experiences. So we've got really good perspectives from both sides. Again, thanks for letting me mention it.
All right. Well, Frank Hayde, and the book is The Mafia and the Machine, that I know a lot of you guys know about because you mention it on Facebook every once in a while. A lot of people have read it, and I think a lot of more people will probably read it after today, because it is a beautiful, well done, well documented overview of Kansas City Mafia from the Black Hand days to the modern era. So I really appreciate you doing that and going to all that work, Frank, and for coming on the podcast. Thanks a lot, Frank.
Thank you, Gary. See you next time.
All right. Well, guys, don't forget, I like to ride motorcycles, so watch out for motorcycles when you're out there. And if you have a problem with PTSD, be sure and go to the VA website and get that hotline if you've been in the service. And if you have a problem with drugs or alcohol, our good friend, former Gambino man, Anthony Ruggiano, is in the treatment center business down in Florida. And he's got a hotline on his website. I think it's reformgangsters.com or something like that. Just start looking for Anthony Ruggiano. So thanks a lot, guys. And we will talk to y'all later. We'll 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 talk.